There is a small red tin sitting on my kitchen windowsill that cost $2 and has kept more bugs out of my house this year than the $700 I used to hand a pest control company every summer, 4 separate checks written to a company whose truck I could set my calendar by. Most people think the spray truck is the only real defense they have against ants and roaches, the only option serious enough to actually work. What almost nobody knows is that the exact ingredient in that truck traces back to one flower, and you can buy the raw version of it for less than a coffee. So why is everyone still paying for the expensive version of something this cheap? My name is Ju Wong. My grandmother ran a small shop outside a town in Wakayama, Japan, for almost 50 years, selling rope, tea, dried fish, and little paper packets of things nobody bothers making by hand anymore. 2 summers ago, I bought my first house, a small place with an old kitchen and a back door that never quite sat flush in its frame. And by July, I had ants marching across my kitchen counter in a line so straight, you could set a ruler against it, and a roach under the stove that I only ever saw for half a second, before it vanished behind the appliance. I did what any reasonable homeowner does. I signed a contract with a pest control company, $175 a visit, 4 visits a year, a truck showing up every 90 days to spray a chemical along my baseboards that smelled faintly of a hospital hallway for about an hour afterward. Add it up, and that is right around $700 a year, sometimes closer to $800 if I called them for an extra visit when the ants came back early, which happened more often than I want to admit, usually right around the 8 or 9 week mark, like clockwork. Faster than the 90 days I was actually paying for. And here is the part that actually bothered me. The ants did not stay gone. 2 months into a 90-day contract, right on schedule, that same line would reappear across the same stretch of counter, like the spray had a calendar of its own, and I would find myself standing there with a paper towel wondering what exactly I was paying for. Quick word before I go further. The old methods my family uses, there is more of it than fits in any one video. I gathered the whole of it into a book you can buy in our pinned comment below. The book is the long version. If you want it, it is there. I will not mention it again. I called my mother one night, frustrated, standing in my kitchen at close to midnight with a spray bottle of window cleaner in my hand because it was the only thing within reach, and asked her what my grandmother used to do about bugs, since as far as I knew, she never once called a company in her life, not in 50 years of running that shop. My mother laughed, actually laughed, and told me to go look at the small red tin my grandmother had given me as a housewarming gift, the one I had set on the windowsill and never actually opened because it looked more like a decoration than something useful. So I want to ask you the same question I asked myself standing in that kitchen. If a company can charge $700 a year and still not solve the problem, what exactly am I paying for? Here is what took me embarrassingly long to understand. The spray a pest control truck puts down works by contact. A bug walks across it, absorbs it, and dies within a day or two. That part is true, and it does work, and I'm not telling you the company is lying about what is in the bottle. But that same chemical starts breaking down the moment it is exposed to sunlight and rain, especially outdoors along a foundation wall, and most companies know it, because it is the same family of active ingredient found in nearly every over-the-counter you can buy at a hardware store, just synthesized instead of grown, and built to be sprayed once and forgotten, rather than reapplied cheaply by hand. Within a matter of weeks, sometimes less along an outdoor wall that gets full sun, the barrier is gone entirely, broken down into compounds that no longer do anything to a bug's nervous system at all. What is left behind is a clean baseboard and an open door, because nobody sealed the actual gap the ants were using to get in, and nobody addressed the reason they wanted in to begin with, which is almost always food or water, sitting somewhere close by. A company charging by the visit has very little financial reason to fix any of that permanently, since a permanent fix is a canceled contract, and a canceled contract is a truck that no longer needs to drive down my street 4 times a year. A resident breaking down and reapplying the barrier herself for pennies instead of dollars has every reason to. This is where the contrast gets sharp. $700 a year, 4 scheduled visits, a truck driving down my street where every neighbor can watch, versus roughly $30 in materials that I still have most of a year later, all of it fitting in a shoebox under my sink. Hard versus simple. Expensive versus a tin that fits in your palm, and a roll of steel wool that costs less than a sandwich. Here is the counterintuitive part, the one that changed how I think about every can of bug spray I have ever bought in my life. The active compound in almost all of it, the thing actually doing the killing, is a synthetic copy of a natural insecticide called pyrethrin, which comes from one particular flower, a small white daisy relative called pyrethrum. Chemists learned to copy its structure so it could be manufactured cheaply at scale and last a little longer on a store shelf before it degrades. But the original plant version still works, still kills the same insects the same way, by attacking their nervous system on contact within hours. And it costs a fraction of what the synthetic version does once you buy it in its raw, dried form, instead of a branded aerosol can with a company's name and a truck fee attached to it. And here is something I did not know, until my mother told me that night on the phone. The flower is the actual reason the modern mosquito coil exists at all. A man named Eiichiro Ueyama got hold of pyrethrum seeds from an American trader back in the 1880s and started growing the flower in Japan, in the same region my grandmother's shop sat in a century later. He ground the dried flower heads into powder and pressed it into incense sticks, and the first version only burned for about 40 minutes before it was spent. When his wife Yuki suggested he coil the sticks into a spiral instead of a straight one, the modern mosquito coil was born, and it burned for 6 or 7 hours instead of 40 minutes, long enough to last through most of a night's sleep. That company is still one of the biggest insecticide makers in Japan today, still built on the same flower, still turning out hundreds of thousands of coils a day from a factory not far from where my grandmother kept her shop. This was never a forgotten grandmother's trick sitting on the edge of folklore. It is the actual foundation the entire modern pest control industry was built on top of, flower first, chemistry company second. Most people just never got introduced to the plain, unbranded version of it. So here is the system, in the order I actually use it, with what it costs and what each piece is for. First step, the one that does the most work for the least effort, and the one I now do the moment I move into any new place, before I even unpack the kitchen. Buy a small tin of dried pyrethrum powder, sometimes labeled insect powder or flea powder depending on the store, at an Asian grocery store or online. About $2 for enough to last a season, sometimes closer to $4 depending on where you find it. I run a thin line of it along every baseboard where I have seen ants, across the kitchen windowsill, and along the strip under the back door where the frame never quite sat flush. I call this the powder line, and the trick most people get wrong is putting too much down at once, thinking more powder means a stronger barrier. It does not. A thin, unbroken line works better than a thick pile, because the bug only needs to walk through it once for the compound to reach its nervous system, and a thick pile just gets kicked into a cloud the first time someone walks past with a broom. One warning worth taking seriously, the same way I would want someone to warn me. Keep it away from fish tanks, since pyrethrins are genuinely harmful to fish, and away from where a cat can lick it directly off a surface, since it is far gentler on mammals than most synthetic sprays, but it is still an insecticide, not a seasoning, and deserves to be treated that way. Second step costs about $6, and it is the one that makes the powder line actually last instead of needing to be redrawn every week, which is the part that used to exhaust me before I understood why it kept failing. A roll of steel wool, pushed firmly into any gap you find around a pipe under the sink, a crack where the siding meets the foundation, the space around a window air conditioner unit where the installer never quite sealed the edges, which is one of the most overlooked entry points in most houses I have seen. Ants and roaches can flatten themselves through a gap the width of a credit card, thinner than most people would believe possible. But they cannot chew through steel wool the way they can chew through caulk or foam insulation, both of which soften over time and eventually give the pest a way back in. I sealed 4 gaps in one afternoon with a $5 roll of it and a pair of work gloves, and the ant line along my counter never came back in the same spot again, not once, through the rest of that summer or the one after it. Third step is free, and it undoes something the ants are doing that most people never notice, because it happens at a scale we cannot smell. Ants do not wander randomly across a counter, looking for food. The first scout ant to find your sugar bowl leaves a scent trail behind her on the way back to the colony, invisible and silent to you, and every ant behind her follows that exact same line without deviating, sometimes for days after the sugar bowl has been washed and put away. Wipe the counter down with plain white vinegar, and you are not just cleaning up crumbs, you are erasing the chemical trail the whole colony is reading like a set of directions. I call this the vinegar wipe, and I do it the same day I see the first ant, not after there are 50 of them marching in a line, because the trail only gets more reinforced the longer it sits. Fourth step costs nothing and solves the problem roaches actually care about more than food, which is water, something most people never think to check because it is not visible sitting out on a counter the way crumbs are. A roach can survive weeks without eating, but only about a week without a water source. So I went around my kitchen and bathroom with a flashlight one Saturday afternoon looking for anything damp, a slow drip under the sink, condensation pooling behind the washing machine where nobody ever looks, a bath mat that never fully dries between uses, a potted plant saucer that stays wet for days after watering. I fixed one slow leak under my kitchen sink, a fitting that had been dripping so slowly I never noticed it until I actually got down on the floor with a flashlight and looked, and the roach I used to see under the stove never showed up again that whole summer, or the one after it. Fifth step is for the evenings I want to sit outside without waving my hand in front of my face every 30 seconds or giving up on the porch entirely once the sun goes down and the yard starts filling with mosquitoes off the neighbor's low spot in the grass. The actual mosquito coil, the spiral kind, still made from that same pyrethrum flower more than 100 years after Ueyama first pressed it into a stick, costs about $4 or $5 for a pack of coils and burns for roughly 6 or 7 hours, which is close to the entire length of an evening outdoors. Light one end, set it in a small dish away from where anyone is sitting directly, upwind if there is any breeze at all, and it does the same job the original stick incense did back in the 1890s, just in a shape that lasts long enough to actually matter through a full night on the porch. And if you would rather not deal with powder at all, there is a store-bought alternative that does a similar job for the crawling insects specifically, and I keep both in the house since they cover slightly different situations. Look for a bag labeled food-grade diatomaceous earth in the garden section of most hardware stores, about $10 a bag, and make sure it says food grade specifically rather than the pool filter kind, since the two are processed differently. It works differently from pyrethrum, a fine dust made from crushed fossilized algae that damages an insect's outer shell physically rather than attacking its nervous system, but it lasts behind appliances and in wall gaps for months at a time without breaking down the way a chemical spray does in sunlight, which makes it a good complement to the powder line rather than a replacement for it. I keep a small amount behind my stove and refrigerator, out of reach of the dog, and away from any spot I would end up breathing it in while cleaning. And I refill it maybe twice a year at most, usually once in spring, and once again toward the end of summer. I want to leave you with something bigger than the bugs themselves, because that was never really the whole point of any of this. This was about realizing I had been paying every 90 days for a company to hand me a temporary version of something that was sitting on a shelf my grandmother left me the entire time. Once I actually opened that red tin instead of leaving it as a decoration on my windowsill, I understood something she never had to explain to me in words, something I do not think she ever would have thought to explain, because to her it was just how a kitchen was kept. A bug does not care how much you spent to keep it out. It only cares whether you left it a door, a crumb, or a drop of standing water, and no amount of money changes that equation. Seal the door, remove the water, erase the trail, and the powder becomes the last line of defense, instead of the only one carrying the whole job by itself. I have not called a pest control company in 2 years, and the money I would have handed them, close to $1,400 over that stretch, is still sitting in my account instead of theirs, which is enough for a plane ticket back to see the shop my grandmother used to run, which is exactly where I am putting it. So here is what I want you to do tonight. Not next week, tonight, while it is still fresh in your mind. Wipe down whichever counter has had ants on it this summer with plain white vinegar, and look under your sinks with a flashlight for anything damp that has been sitting there longer than you realized. This weekend, find a tin of pyrethrum powder, or even the coil version at a local Asian grocery store, and run a thin line along the one entry point you already know your bugs are using, the one you have been walking past for months. Tell me in the comments which pest showed up first in your house this year, and whether the line worked by the following week, because I genuinely want to know how it goes in a house that is not mine, wherever you happen to be watching this from. I read every one of them. Next time, I am going to show you what my grandmother used to do to keep her good linens from ever smelling musty in the rainy season, using nothing but a folded newspaper and one thing sitting in your pantry that has nothing to do with laundry at all. Until then, check your baseboards before you check your wallet, and remember that most of what gets sold to us as new was already sitting on a shelf somewhere, waiting for somebody to actually open the tin.